My name is Isabel Hart, and the day my family tried to laugh me out of an auction was the day everything finally shifted. The cold Aspen wind hit me first as I stepped out of the rented SUV, tugging at my simple black sweater and reminding me just how out of place I must have looked among the billionaires and heirs gliding across the snow-dusted gravel. Aspen auctions weren't just events, they were arenas for the wealthy to measure their power without ever raising their voices. And there I was, holding nothing but calm breath and an old pair of boots. I had barely closed the car door when my sister's voice sliced through the air. Caroline. Always polished, always adored, always ready to perform cruelty if it earned her a laugh. "Oh, look," she announced with the delight of someone unwrapping a gift. The broke girl showed up at the auction. Conversations paused. Heads turned. My parents laughed, really laughed, as if they'd been waiting all morning for their punchline to arrive. My mother pressed a manicured hand to her chest dramatically. "She probably thinks this is a garage sale," she said, and my dad let out a chuckle that echoed far louder than it needed to. A few strangers glanced at me with quick, dismissive curiosity, the kind reserved for someone clearly not belonging to their tax bracket. Once upon a time, that would have gutted me. Once upon a time, I would have felt the humiliation burn all the way to my bones. But that version of me, the girl who apologized for existing, was gone. I didn't respond. I didn't look at them. I simply walked toward the registration hall, the crunch of gravel under my boots steadier than my heartbeat had any right to be. Inside, the warmth wrapped around me instantly. The room was all glass, polished stone, and quiet luxury where staff checked financial approvals for bidders worth more than small nations. I stepped up to the counter, meeting the registrar's professional smile. "Name?" she asked. "Isabel Hart," I said. Her fingers froze for a second. Recognition, surprise, respect, I couldn't tell which. But then she nodded, typed quickly, and slid a sleek black paddle across the counter toward me. "You're approved for the full bidding range, Miss Hart." Welcome, the full range. I felt the weight of it settle into my palm, as steady as truth. Behind me, Caroline's laughter died mid-breath. My parents went silent. No one spoke, but the air shifted, sharp as glass cracking. They didn't know. They had no idea who I had become. They had no idea what I could afford. They had no idea what was coming. And maybe that's why I want to ask you, have you ever walked into a room where people decided your value before you even opened your mouth? If you have, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know I'm not alone in this feeling. Because 30 minutes after their laughter echoed across that courtyard, I would raise this paddle and walk out owning the $15 million estate they came here to claim. I was never the broke girl. Not then. Not now. Not ever again. If you want to understand why standing in that Aspen auction felt like crossing a line I could never return from, you need to know where I came from. I grew up in a middle-class home in Denver, not wealthy, not poor, but comfortable enough that my parents believed image mattered more than anything. And in their carefully curated world, there were two daughters, one who fit the picture perfectly, and one who didn't. Caroline, of course, was the masterpiece. The golden child. The one everyone praised at church, at school events, at neighborhood barbecues. She had the kind of beauty my mother said, photographs well, and a personality that made adults fawn over her. She was social, charming, always saying the right thing, always shining in exactly the ways my parents valued. So, they invested in her private schools, ballet lessons, pageants, French tutors, everything they believed would shape her into a future, someone. And I? I was the daughter who preferred to take apart old radios in the garage rather than attend tea party playdates. I loved wires, circuits, problem solving, the clean logic of code, the feeling of creating something from nothing. I loved learning how things worked, how data behaved, how technology could make the world move faster and smarter. But to my parents, it wasn't talent. It wasn't even a hobby worth mentioning. It was embarrassing. "Isabel just plays with nerd toys," my mother would sigh, as if it ruined family photos. "That's not a real path to success." My father was more blunt. "Engineering isn't for girls. And even if it were, it doesn't make real money unless you're some kind of genius," which she isn't. They said it casually, as if discussing the weather, but they said it often enough that the words carved themselves into the walls of our house and into me. When Caroline sparkled, as my mother liked to put it, I faded into the background. She got new dresses and violin recitals. I got laundry duty. She got encouragement and tutors. I got eye rolls and comments like, "You should learn from your sister. She knows how to present herself." And the comparisons never stopped. At dinner, Caroline won another award today. At family gatherings, Caroline has such potential, we're still trying to figure out what Isabel's good at. At school events, "Caroline, come stand with us, Isabel, can you take the photo?" I learned early that love in our house was conditional, and I didn't meet the conditions. By the time I graduated high school, the gap between us wasn't just emotional, it was structural. Caroline proudly announced she'd been accepted to a private liberal arts college my parents adored. I waited for my turn to share that I'd been accepted into an engineering program at a respected university. I waited for support, maybe even excitement. What I got was a shrug. And then a sentence that changed everything. "We're only paying for Caroline's tuition," my father said. "She's the one with real potential." My mother didn't even look up from her phone. "Tech degrees aren't practical for girls anyway," she added. "You'll figure something out." Something inside me cracked, but not in the way they expected. I didn't break, I hardened. I enrolled in community college, took online courses late at night, and worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to cover tuition and rent. I cleaned offices at dawn, served coffee after classes, and coded freelance projects until my vision blurred. And every time I dragged myself home with aching hands and a crowded mind, my parents reminded me, "See? This is what happens when you choose the wrong path." Caroline didn't help. She loved the attention too much. And she loved her role as the chosen one. The moment that truly severed something between us happened at a family Christmas party. I must have been 19. Someone asked how school was going for me, and before I could answer, Caroline laughed, loud and sharp enough to slice the room in half. "School? Isabel isn't built for academics. She's better at wiping tables than taking exams." My mother giggled. My father nodded in agreement. Guests exchanged awkward smiles, waiting for me to laugh along. I didn't. I felt something in my chest close, like a door locking from the inside. That night, after everyone went home, after the lights went out and the house went quiet, I packed a single suitcase. No dramatic speech, no goodbye, no tears. I walked out the door at 19 years old, leaving behind a family that never once believed in me. They thought I was running away from failure. They had no idea I was running toward a life they couldn't imagine and would never see coming. Leaving home at 19 meant starting from zero, but it also meant starting clean. No more comparisons. No more dismissive looks over dinner. No more being told that the things I loved were pointless. I landed in Seattle with one suitcase, $214, and a determination so sharp it felt like armor. I rented a room in a cramped basement apartment that smelled like old carpet and rain-soaked concrete, worked whatever shifts I could get, and kept studying. My life became a cycle of effort. Work, learn, code, sleep, repeat. And then, a door opened quietly, almost accidentally. I applied for an entry-level position at a small logistics startup that no one outside of a niche tech forum had ever heard of. They were scrappy, underfunded, operating out of an office above a brewery, and yet something about them felt alive. They were trying to fix a problem I had always been fascinated by. How companies could move goods faster and cheaper using smarter data, not just bigger warehouses. During the interview, the founder, a weary but brilliant man named Marcus Hale, asked if I had any experience with supply chain optimization. I showed him an algorithm I'd been tinkering with, something I had built during my community college years, to predict order surges and reduce bottlenecks. Marcus stared at the code for so long I thought he'd forgotten I was in the room. Then he leaned back, removed his glasses and said, "This should not be possible for one person to write." That moment reshaped my life. Marcus hired me on the spot, not as an assistant, not as some low-level analyst, but as a junior engineer with room to grow. And grow I did. The startup was chaotic, beautiful, exhausting, and exhilarating all at once. I slept under my desk during product launches, learned to handle servers that crashed at the worst possible times, and became the unofficial translator between the data team and the operations team. Marcus became my mentor, not the kind who lectured, but the kind who quietly placed opportunities in front of me and trusted me to rise to meet them. He was the first person in my life who didn't laugh when I said I wanted to build something meaningful. He asked questions, offered guidance, and above all, believed in me without needing proof. 2 years into the job, I presented him with a prototype of a predictive routing system that could cut delivery delays by nearly 40%. Most people would have dismissed it as ambitious. Marcus saw potential. "We're going to build this," he said. And we did. It wasn't easy. It required months of testing, hundreds of failed simulations, and more caffeine than any doctor would ever approve. But when it really worked, it changed the trajectory of the entire company. Word spread. Investors started circling. The startup expanded. Clients signed contracts faster than we could process them. And then came the email that stunned us all. A major national logistics corporation wanted to acquire the startup for an 8-figure sum. When Marcus gathered the team and announced the buyout, there was a moment, just a flicker, when 19-year-old me resurfaced, remembering every time my parents mocked the idea of me working in tech. Then he told us we would be receiving equity payouts based on our contributions. My share was life-changing. Overnight, quietly, privately, invisibly, I became a millionaire. I didn't buy a fancy car. I didn't redesign my life. I didn't call my parents to say, "See? I told you." No, I reinvested. I built a small, independent consultancy specializing in data-driven logistics solutions. My work spread through word of mouth. Companies in Chicago, Los Angeles, Boston, and even abroad reached out. I ended up traveling, learning, growing, not for status, not for applause, but because every project taught me something new about what I was capable of. Meanwhile, my parents and Caroline continued living in their curated world, believing I was either a barista, a cashier, or maybe on my more successful days a receptionist. They never asked. I never corrected them. They had made it clear long ago that they didn't want to know who I was becoming, only who they believed I should have been. And in that silence, in that space between who they saw and who I truly was, I found a strange kind of freedom. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't proving anything. I was building quietly, steadily, relentlessly. By the time the Aspen auction appeared on my radar, my consultancy had grown into a multi-million-dollar firm with partnerships I once could only dream about. But my family still saw me as the broke girl, the invisible one, the forgettable one. And I let them believe it until the day they walked into that auction determined to win an estate they thought would secure their legacy. They had no idea that the girl they dismissed had already built a legacy of her own. But I wasn't in Aspen because of them. I wasn't there to prove anything, to flash wealth, or to reclaim some emotional victory that had been denied to me growing up. My reason for attending that auction had been forming for years, long before I even knew the estate would be available. The property in question was not just another luxury home with oversized windows and excessive square footage. It was a $15 million architectural masterpiece known as the Ridgway Estate, once owned by Adrian Ridgway, a legendary architect whose philosophy centered around creating spaces that elevate human potential. His estate, perched against the Rockies with sweeping views of the valley, was designed as a living sanctuary where ideas could take shape. The studios had skylights engineered to capture sunlight at precise angles. The lower-level hall was rumored to have acoustics so perfect that musicians used it for private recordings. It wasn't a mansion, it was a brainchild, a place built to encourage imagination. When news broke that Ridgway's heirs were auctioning the property, wealthy families across Colorado buzzed like bees around honey. And among the loudest of them were my parents. To them, Ridgway Estate represented prestige, social revival, an emblem that our family, once just middle class, could finally rise into the circles they envied. They believed Caroline was the key. Caroline, with her curated lifestyle brand of neutral palettes, overpriced candles, and inspirational quotes, had been desperately trying to elevate her online presence into something resembling true influence. But she needed a showpiece, a place so breathtaking it could become the visual heart of her brand. A mansion in Aspen designed by a legend? It was the jackpot she had always wanted. My parents supported her obsession wholeheartedly. To them, it wasn't indulgence, it was destiny. Caroline is the one who can take our family name to the next level, my father would say at gatherings. She understands image. Meanwhile, the few times my name was mentioned, it came with hesitant shrugs, as if they weren't sure whether I had a job, a place to live, or any semblance of stability. They didn't ask, of course. Their ignorance wasn't lack of information, it was lack of interest. And that made the contrast almost poetic, because while they were circling the auction with dreams of glamour, my reason for attending couldn't have been more different. Over the years, as my consultancy grew and I took on more clients, I discovered something that stuck with me. Young women in STEM were still fighting battles society pretended were already won. I mentored interns who had been discouraged by teachers, belittled by classmates, dismissed by interviewers. I met young women who hid their intelligence, so they wouldn't be labeled intimidating. Others cried in parking lots after meetings where their contributions were ignored. I saw myself in all of them, girls who had the brilliance but lacked the support. And somewhere along the way, an idea began to form. What if I created a place where women in STEM could gather, learn, collaborate, and build without apology? Not a corporate office with fluorescent lights and cubicles. A sanctuary for innovators, dreamers, problem solvers. A place built to nurture possibility. When I saw photos of Ridgeway Estate, I felt something stir inside me. The architectural philosophy of fostering creativity aligned perfectly with what I envisioned. And the thought that young women who had been belittled, underestimated, sidelined could walk through those doors and feel powerful? I knew then I had to try. So, I prepared. Secured funding. Built a quiet coalition of supporters, activated lines of credit large enough to compete with legacy wealth. I didn't tell a soul in my family. Not because I wanted to surprise them, but because they were no longer part of my decision-making, no longer capable of understanding the scale of what I aimed to build. I arrived in Aspen, resolved, focused, grounded. But the moment I stepped out of my SUV and heard Caroline's mocking voice echo across the courtyard, something unexpected happened. A familiar pain resurfaced, like a bruise pressed too hard. I hadn't come to fight them, but they greeted me like an enemy anyway. Their words weren't just insults, they were reminders of every year I spent being dismissed, minimized, forgotten. And even though I told myself the goal wasn't revenge, I couldn't deny the sting. Still, I kept walking. I didn't come to reclaim old wounds. I came to build futures for women who deserved a place to grow. A place they'd never been given. I came because Ridgeway Estate wasn't a trophy. It was an opportunity. And in that quiet moment when the registrar placed the bidding paddle in my hand and confirmed my approval for the full range, I felt something shift. I wasn't competing with my family. I was simply stepping into the life I had built, one they never imagined possible. They came for a showpiece. I came for a mission. Only one of us understood the true value of the estate. The auction began with the kind of quiet intensity that always precedes something expensive changing hands. People settled into their seats beneath chandeliers shaped like frozen waterfalls, each crystal catching the afternoon light and scattering it across the room in soft glimmers. The air hummed with conversations about portfolios, interest rates, and market forecasts, voices belonging to people who were accustomed to buying things that most of the world would only ever see in magazines. I took a seat in the back row, the paddle resting lightly against my knee. From there, I had a perfect view of the stage, the auctioneer, the staff, and unavoidably my family. Caroline, draped in an ivory coat with fur trim, sat with her legs crossed, as though posing for a lifestyle photoshoot. My mother leaned in to whisper something, and whatever it was made Caroline throw her head back in a laugh far louder than necessary. My father scanned the room with a smug confidence, the kind that came from years of believing his eldest daughter was destined for greatness and his youngest barely qualified as a footnote. When the auctioneer stepped forward and tapped his microphone, the room fell into an expectant hush. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we present the Ridgeway Estate, an architectural landmark valued at an opening bid of $8 million. A ripple of interest moved across the audience, a subtle tightening of posture, a shift in attention. Even after all my preparation, hearing the numbers spoken aloud still made my pulse rise. $8 million. It was a figure that would have once felt like an impossible distance from anything connected to my life. Now, it was merely the starting point. The auctioneer continued outlining the estate's features, its history, its acreage, its design pedigree. Each detail made me more certain that I was exactly where I needed to be. Then the bidding began. A man in the front row raised his paddle instantly. 8.5. The auctioneer acknowledged. Another bidder, a woman with a sleek bob haircut, countered with 9. The numbers climbed quickly. 9.5. 10 million. 10 million won. The room warmed with the rising tension. Caroline joined the bidding with a flourish, lifting her paddle as if she were conducting an orchestra. 10.2. She said proudly when the auctioneer called for it, not even bothering to wait for a rival bidder. My father smiled approvingly, nodding like the proud coach of a winning athlete. My mother clapped once in excitement. But when someone countered with 10.3, Caroline's smile faltered for half a heartbeat before she forced it back into place. 10.5. She called, pushing her chin forward. The auctioneer acknowledged her eagerly. From where I sat, I could hear my parents' voices carrying across the quiet room. "She's so confident," my mother whispered. "Caroline knows how to play this game." My father chuckled. Well, with her eye for value, how could she not? Isabel couldn't even buy a garage. The snide remark hung in the air far longer than they intended. A couple sitting 2 rows ahead turned discreetly to glance at me. I didn't react. I kept breathing. Steady, quiet, choosing stillness over hurt. I lifted my eyes to the stage, not to them. I reminded myself. I wasn't here to prove anything. I wasn't here to fight old battles. Ridgeway Estate was not an arena, it was a vision. A door. A beginning. The bidding continued, intense and unrelenting. 11 million was reached, then 11.3. The man in the tailored navy suit dropped out at 11.4. The woman with the sleek bob stopped at 11.5. By the time it hit 12 million, nearly half the initial bidders had lowered their paddles for good. The tension in the room thickened, charged like the air before a storm. Caroline raised her paddle again. 12.2, she declared confidently. Her voice echoed across the hall. A few people murmured in approval, or maybe surprise. My parents beamed at her, radiating satisfaction. They wanted people to see their pride. They wanted the room to know their daughter was poised to acquire a property that symbolized prestige and elevated social standing. And behind all that pride was something darker, something I'd learned to recognize even as a child. Winning wasn't just about owning something. It was about showing the world that someone else couldn't. Caroline wanted the estate for her brand. My parents wanted it for their reputation. But deep down, they also wanted to ensure that if Caroline succeeded, it would confirm their belief that I had been the problem all along. I stayed in the back row, saying nothing, doing nothing, letting time work for me. The bankers who had processed my financial credentials had been very clear. I was approved to bid up to 20 million. That number wasn't just a limit, it was leverage. It meant I could wait, watch, breathe, and strike when the moment was right. At 12.5 million, another couple bowed out. At 12.7, only 4 bidders remained. Caroline, a tech investor from San Francisco, a real estate developer from New York, and a private buyer who had remained silent for most of the auction. One by one, their resolve cracked. The developer dropped out at 13, the investor followed at 13.3. Now it was just Caroline and the quiet bidder, an older man with silver hair and a gaze that flickered toward the exit as if already anticipating defeat. 13.5. Caroline called. The man hesitated, then lifted his paddle. 13.7. A ripple of interest swept across the room. Caroline didn't like competition, not in school, not at family gatherings, and certainly not in a room full of strangers watching her performance. Her jaw tightened. 14 million, she countered, her tone sharp. My parents looked thrilled, practically glowing. She's going to win, my mother whispered. Of course she is, my father replied smugly. This is simply meant to be. I remained silent in the back row, my fingers brushing the edge of my paddle. I could feel the shift happening, the subtle unraveling of confidence, the thinning of the field, the narrowing of possibilities. It was almost time. The older man lowered his paddle. He was done. Only Caroline remained. The auctioneer's voice rose. 14 million, going once. My heart beat its steady rhythm. Going twice. The room held its breath. I didn't move yet. Not because I wasn't ready, but because the moment itself wasn't ready. I'd spent years building a life in silence. I could wait a few seconds more. The auctioneer inhaled to close the bid. And I felt the entire room shift, leaning toward the inevitable. But inevitability is only real when no one challenges it. My hand rested calmly on my unmoved paddle. My breath was even. My purpose was clear. The estate wasn't hers. And soon, everyone in that chandelier-lit room would know it. $14 million. The number hung in the air like a chandelier crystal catching the last ray of light before dusk swallows it. The auctioneer repeated it with theatrical precision, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. 14 million, going once. He didn't know not yet that this was the moment the energy in the room began to tilt, shifting like a seesaw just before it drops. I could see it clearly from my seat in the back, the subtle panic tightening Caroline's jaw, the way her polished smile flickered like a candle in the wind. 14 million wasn't just another bid for her, it was the limit. The edge. The point where aspirations scraped against reality. My parents had talked for weeks about their comfortable budget, boasting about liquidity, connections, and assets. But the documents their bank submitted for pre-approval were not a mystery. I had seen them by complete coincidence, because bidders' financial tiers were displayed on a public list sorted by registration number. They were approved for $14.2 million. Not a cent more. That extra $200,000 was the breathing room they believed would carry them through a bidding war. And to be fair, for most bidders, it would have. But not today. Not with me sitting silently behind them. Caroline didn't know that yet, though her instincts were sharp enough to notice that something wasn't aligning. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lowered her paddle into her lap, gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles paled. Her mother leaned toward her, whispering breathless encouragement, "You're winning, sweetheart. Just hold steady. No one is going to go beyond that number." My father nodded in rigid confidence, though the stiffness in his posture betrayed the truth they were too close to their financial ceiling for comfort. "This is psychological warfare now," he murmured like a seasoned strategist. "Anyone else would be foolish to cross 14. Anyone else." The phrase almost made me smile. But I stayed still. Silent. Predictable in a way that made people underestimate me. The auctioneer's voice rose again, pulling every breath in the room toward him. 14 million, going twice. The words stretched, slow and heavy, until they vibrated inside my ribs. And beneath that resonance, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket, a soft vibration that felt like a drumbeat marking the next chapter. I slid the device out discreetly. It was a message from my CFO, Emma, a woman who had guided me through more financial negotiations than anyone in my life. The notification preview glowed with concise certainty. "Funds secured. You're cleared to jump anytime." A warmth spread through me. Not excitement, not triumph, but confirmation. The kind of reassurance that comes from knowing your work, your planning, your sleepless nights, your risks, all converge to carry you exactly where you intended to be. I locked the screen and let the phone slip silently back into my pocket. My posture didn't change. My paddle didn't move. I didn't even blink. And that stillness, my refusal to play the role expected of me, began to eat at Caroline. She kept glancing backward, unable to stop herself, searching for my reaction. For any sign of agitation or defeat. She wanted to see me uncomfortable. Wanted me to fidget. Wanted me to reveal the inferiority she'd spent decades believing was woven into my DNA. But I wasn't giving her anything. I sat as unmoving as stone. At one point her eyes locked onto mine. What she found there wasn't fear, it was composure. That single moment unsettled her so deeply that she snapped her head back around, whispering harshly to my mother. "Why is she even here? She's acting strange." Strange? Perhaps. But only because she'd never seen me stand in my own power before. My parents misread her agitation as nerves from the bidding war. My father leaned in, confidence swelling inside him like a balloon ready to burst. "Don't worry," he said reassuringly. "Everyone else has dropped out. This will be ours. No one has the guts or the money to step past 14. My mother nodded vigorously, parroting her favorite line. People know their limits. If they had turned around really looked at me, they might have noticed the irony. Because I had spent my entire life breaking limits, they tried to impose on me. They might have noticed the paddle resting lightly in my hand, not clenched, not trembling, but poised. They might have noticed the quiet confidence radiating from me like heat from a stone warmed in the sun. But they didn't turn. They didn't see me, they never had. And that blindness, their refusal to imagine a version of me stronger, smarter, wealthier, more capable than the caricature they created, was the very thing that would undo them. The auctioneer inhaled deeply, preparing to drop the gavel. 14 million. Going twice. The room held its collective breath, suspended in a moment so fragile it could shatter under the weight of a single raised hand. Caroline straightened her spine, lifting her chin with the poise of someone who believed she was moments away from her coronation. My parents leaned forward, already envisioning headlines, social media posts, and dinner party conversations where they would casually mention owning the Ridgeway estate. But beneath all that performance, beneath all that ambition, there was a truth they didn't know yet, one that was about to unfold with the clean, irreversible precision of a falling blade. They were at their limit, and I was nowhere near mine. I kept waiting, letting the suspense coil tighter, letting the silence grow louder, letting them believe. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the power. And sometimes, the deepest form of justice is simply allowing people to walk themselves directly into the moment they never saw coming. 14.5 million, going once. The auctioneer's voice rose with theatrical clarity, echoing through the vaulted hall like a declaration carved into stone. Conversations fell away. The rustling of programs ceased. Even the air itself seemed to pause, as if holding its breath for what came next. 14.5 million. Going twice. Ice dime. Caroline straightened in her seat, smoothing her perfect hair and lifting her chin as though preparing for a photographer. My parents grasped each other's hands, eyes shining with the anticipation of victory. To them, the estate was already theirs. They saw their future unfolding, Caroline giving interviews from the sunlit courtyard, photo shoots on the balcony, parties filled with Aspen elites marveling at her taste. They believed they had outplayed every bidder in the room. They believed their limit would never be threatened. They believed their narrative, the one where I was nothing more than an afterthought, was permanently intact. And in that suspended moment, the world waited for the next sound, the fall of the auctioneer's gavel. But the next sound came from me. A soft inhale, the whisper of certainty settling into my bones. Then the upward motion of my hand as I lifted my paddle slowly, deliberately, silently. 15 million, I said. My voice didn't need to be loud, it carried anyway. Carried across the rows of seats, across the polished marble, across the hearts of every person who turned to stare. It landed in the center of the room, like a strike of lightning. For a full second, no one moved. The auctioneer blinked. The staff froze. The audience straightened in their chairs. You could almost hear the collective thought rippling through the hall. Who? Then a second wave. Her? My family reacted last. The human brain sometimes needs a moment to process a blow it never expected. And then it hit them. What? My mother whispered, her voice cracking. No, 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 no. My father's mouth hung open before he muttered a curse under his breath, the kind he only used when business deals went sideways. But Caroline snapped first. She shot up from her seat so quickly, her chair screeched backward. She doesn't have that kind of money, she shouted, arms flailing toward the auctioneer as if she could physically stop time with the force of her desperation. A few heads turned away, embarrassed for her. Others leaned forward with predatory delight. There was nothing the wealthy loved more than unexpected drama. The auctioneer lifted his hand to calm the room, regaining his composure. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice slipping into professionalism even as excitement flickered beneath it. Bidder number 73. He glanced at his clipboard. Miss Isabel Hart is a fully verified bidder. All financial credentials have been confirmed. Gasps moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. My parents visibly deflated. Caroline shook her head repeatedly, as if reality might reverse itself if she refused to accept it. "No. This is wrong," she said, voice trembling. "She's lying. She must be lying." I didn't respond. I didn't even look at her. I kept my eyes on the auctioneer, posture straight, expression controlled, heart steady. Because in that moment, there was nothing left to defend. The truth had already spoken for itself. The auctioneer waited for a counterbid, scanning the room with a hopeful glimmer. 15 million was a far more thrilling number than 14.5. But no one raised a paddle. Not the quiet older bidder. Not the investors. Not the couple from New York. And certainly not my family, trapped at their limit with no path forward. "Do we have 15.1? The auctioneer tried, voice lifting with one last attempt. Silence. Pure, deafening silence. The kind that breaks years of noise in a single instant. "Very well," the auctioneer said, picking up the gavel with a flourish, his enthusiasm barely contained. 15 million, going once. My mother's hand trembled visibly. Going twice. My father shut his eyes, as if bracing for impact. Caroline whispered, "Please, anyone, don't let her win." But no one challenged. No one dared. And the hammer fell. A crisp, echoing crack that split the air cleanly in two. "Sold to Miss Isabel Hart." A shockwave moved through me, not elation, not triumph, but a quiet, reverent sense of alignment, like stepping fully into a life that had been waiting for me all along. The Ridgeway estate was mine. My parents sagged back in their seats, stunned into silence. Caroline looked as if someone had pulled the ground out from under her. Her face flushed red, then drained pale, the humiliation too large for her to swallow. "This isn't real," she whispered, shaking her head. She can't do that." But I had done it. And not out of spite. Not out of revenge, not to embarrass her. I did it because I could. Because I had built the means. Because the estate had a purpose, far larger than any of them understood. And because the girl they mocked, underestimated, and dismissed had grown into a woman who didn't need their permission or their approval to claim her place in the world. As the audience murmured and the auctioneer moved on to the next lot, I sat still for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I stood, my paddle hanging loosely at my side, and walked out into the winter air. Behind me, my family's whispered disbelief chased me like a shadow, but no shadow can touch the one who's walking toward her own light. The Ridgeway estate was mine, and they had just learned too late that I had never been the person they thought I was. The moment the gavel struck, the air shifted, charged, electric, almost metallic. People murmured, chairs scraped back, and the auction staff hurried to prepare the paperwork. I should have expected my family's reaction. I should have walked straight to the registration office, without pausing, without letting them catch up, but maybe some part of me wanted to see who they would become without an audience. Maybe I wanted to see the truth behind their polished social masks. I stepped into the crisp Aspen afternoon, snow beginning to drift lazily from the sky. My breath formed a faint cloud as I exhaled, steady and calm. I had taken only a few steps across the courtyard when I heard footsteps pounding after me, 3 sets, frantic and uneven. "Isabel!" My father barked, his voice cutting through the cold air. I turned slowly. My mother's face was twisted with disbelief, her lips trembling like she was close to sobbing or screaming. Caroline stood between them, trembling not from cold but fury. Her perfect hair, flawless makeup, and curated composure had all cracked open in the last 10 minutes, revealing the raw, unfiltered temper beneath. She pointed at me with a shaking hand. "You." Her voice broke. "You ruined everything." I said nothing, letting the storm swirl until it revealed its true form. My father stepped forward first, jabbing a finger toward the auction hall. "What the hell was that stunt? You embarrassed your sister. You destroyed her chance at securing her future. Do you have any idea how important that estate was for her brand?" His voice rose with every sentence, puffing like an engine overheating. My mother clutched her purse against her chest as if steadying herself. "You should have told us you were planning something like this," she snapped. You blindsided us. This was Caroline's dream. Caroline's dream. Caroline's future. Caroline's brand. There it was again, the gravitational pull of a family orbit that had never made room for me. My mother's voice sharpened to a cutting edge. How dare you outbid your own sister? I let the silence stretch before answering, measured, unshaken. I didn't outbid my sister, I said. I bought something I need. That alone made Caroline explode. Need? She shrieked. You don't need a $15 million estate. You don't need anything except handouts. You parasite. Her hands flailed as if trying to grab the words from the air and hurl them at me. You've never achieved anything. You've never done anything. You walked out on this family because you couldn't handle real expectations. I didn't flinch. Not when she called me a parasite. Not when my father nodded at her words. Not when my mother looked at me with a glare so sharp it could have sliced frost. Because none of their words were new. I'd heard versions of them since I was old enough to understand sentences. I took a slow breath, and when I spoke, my voice didn't tremble once. I left home, I said, not because I was poor. Not because I was weak. I left because every room I walked into made me feel like I didn't exist. Caroline recoiled as if the truth itself had slapped her. My mother blinked rapidly, her lips parting, but no denial came. My father's jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. So I kept going. I left because you treated me like background noise. Because every dream I had was dismissed. Because every effort I made was belittled. Because you were all so busy celebrating Caroline that you forgot you had another daughter. Emotion rippled across my mother's face, guilt, defensiveness, confusion, blending together like mismatched paint. My father gripped his coat lapels as if anchoring himself. We gave you everything. A home, food, clothes. I laughed. Soft, disbelieving. You gave me shelter, but you never gave me space to grow. That made him falter. Caroline stepped forward, rage simmering like boiling water. So what? She spat. You come back now and, what? Try to show you're better than me. Is that it? I shook my head slowly. No, Caroline. This has never been about you. She froze. The words hit differently because she'd been raised to believe everything was about her. I continued, level and clear. I didn't buy that estate to hurt you. I didn't even know you were planning to bid on it until I walked in today. I let the truth sink in. I bought it because I built something on my own. A mission. A purpose. And I finally have the means to make it real. Caroline's mouth opened then closed. She didn't know how to fight a battle that wasn't centered around her. And one more thing, I said, letting the years I had swallowed down finally surface. Today, I didn't destroy your dream. I stepped closer, meeting her eyes head-on. I reclaimed a part of my life you all tried to take from me. My voice softened not with weakness, but with clarity. Every time you mocked me, every time you dismissed my interests, every time you made me the family ghost, you carved out a space where I had to learn who I was without you. I paused, and for the first time since childhood, they were the ones silent before me. What I bought today isn't a house, I said. It's a beginning. Mine, not yours. Caroline's expression broke, a mixture of humiliation and disbelief. My father opened his mouth but had no argument left. My mother's shoulders sagged, the weight of recognition finally pressing down on her. They had expected the broke girl they invented. Instead, they met the woman they never bothered to know. And for the first time in my life, I walked away not running, not escaping, not defeated but fully, completely free from the version of me they had tried so hard to keep small. 2 days after the auction, the Ridgeway estate no longer felt like a battlefield where emotional wars had been waged. The echo of my family's accusations had faded, washed away by the clarity of what came next. I didn't dwell on their reactions. I didn't replay their words. There was too much to build, too much waiting to be shaped into something meaningful. The road leading up to the estate curved along the mountainside, and as I drove toward it on that first morning as its owner, I felt a calm determination settle into my bones. The property's tall windows reflected the sunrise, casting golden streaks across the snow-covered grounds. The place radiated potential untapped, waiting, almost expectant. I parked and stepped out just as a black SUV pulled up behind me. Out came the design team I had hired, 2 architects, 1 interior specialist, and a structural engineer. A moment later, Daniel stepped out as well, the project manager the auction house recommended. He was in his mid-30s, dressed neatly in a navy coat, his expression open and curious. "Morning, Isabel," he greeted, offering a warm handshake. "Ready to walk the space?" I nodded. "More than ready." We entered through the main foyer, our footsteps echoing across the sweeping marble floors. The estate was breathtaking in its original form: vaulted ceilings, long corridors washed in natural light, walls lined with bookshelves and framed sketches by Ridgway himself. But I viewed it differently from the others. They saw beauty, luxury, history. I saw classrooms, labs, workbenches, conference corners where young women would sit together, solving problems the world hadn't imagined yet. "Let's start downstairs," I said, leading them toward a wide staircase that spiraled to the lower level. The architects exchanged an intrigued glance. They'd assumed we would begin with the living spaces or the studios areas. Most buyers typically wanted to renovate into lounges or entertainment rooms. But I wasn't here to preserve a rich man's lifestyle. I was here to build a future. The lower hall, with its perfect acoustics and open floor plan, spread before us like a vast blank canvas. "This," I said, gesturing around, "will be the academic wing." Daniel raised his brows. "Academic?" "Yes," I answered, stepping forward as ideas poured out in the same rhythm they had lived inside my mind for months. "Partition this space into 3 main sections. A classroom here." I indicated the eastern wall where sunlight poured in. "With modular seating, digital boards, AR systems, whatever can help young women explore STEM fields with hands-on learning. And over here, toward the far corner, we'll build the first lab. Something flexible: computers, microcontrollers, prototyping tools." The structural engineers scribbled notes, while the architects murmured plans. I walked farther into the room. "This central area will be open. A collaboration hub, whiteboards, sofas, project tables. A place where ideas have enough room to breathe." When I turned, I caught Daniel looking at me, not with confusion, not with skepticism, but with something that resembled admiration. "You've thought about this a long time," he said quietly. "Years," I replied. "I just never had the space to make it real." I led the group upstairs next, toward a long, sunlit hallway overlooking the mountains. "Here is where the mentorship offices will go," I said. "A place for coaching, career guidance, networking sessions. Women in tech often don't drop out because of skill, they drop out because of lack of support." Daniel finished softly. I met his eyes. "Exactly." He nodded, jotting down more notes. "And the upper-level West Wing?" "Scholarship administration," I said. "We'll create 2 offices, plus a quiet room for students who need resources, grant writing help, interview preparation, equipment loans." The estate wasn't transforming into a school exactly. It was becoming something between an innovation center and a sanctuary. A home for girls who were like I once was: brilliant, overlooked, pushed aside. We stepped into one of Ridgway's original glass studios, where the sunlight hit at angles that made the entire room glow. Dust motes floated peacefully in the air. "This space," I said more softly, "will be for workshops." "Workshops?" one architect asked. I nodded. "Leadership training, confidence seminars, coding nights, weekend build-a-thons. Anything that helps young women learn how powerful they actually are." The team grew silent for a moment, absorbing all of it. The estate no longer looked like an untouched monument to wealth. It looked like a blueprint for transformation. Daniel walked toward the window, studying the expansive view before turning back to me. "I've worked on a lot of projects," he said slowly, "but never one with this kind of vision." There was no flattery in his tone, only sincerity. "Most people buy places like this to hide from the world," he continued. "You're turning it into a place that will change the world for someone." I inhaled deeply, letting the truth of that settle. "This isn't revenge," I said quietly. "It's restoration." Daniel tilted his head. "For the girls you'll help?" "For them," I said. "And for me." Because standing in that room, surrounded by blueprints and sunlight, I realized something profound. Reclaiming my life wasn't about proving my family wrong. It wasn't about the auction or the money. It wasn't even about building a center. It was about healing the younger versions of myself who had once believed she wasn't enough. This, I said, sweeping my gaze around the estate, isn't payback, it's purpose. Daniel smiled in that soft, understanding way that only people who have built themselves from the ground up seem capable of. Then let's build it right, he said. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't just stepping away from where I came from. I was stepping toward where I was meant to be. The article broke on a Thursday morning. Young tech entrepreneur buys $15 million Ridgeway estate to launch STEM foundation for underserved girls. The headline was everywhere within hours, shared on LinkedIn, reposted on tech blogs, discussed on a local morning show. Someone even emailed me a screenshot of a national news anchor referencing my initiative as a bold step toward shifting gender barriers in the tech pipeline. It felt unreal, humbling, bigger than me. And yet, the moment I saw the news spreading, a quiet understanding settled in my chest. My family would come, not because they cared, not because they finally saw my worth, but because public validation had always been the currency they understood best. The next morning, as I met with Daniel and the architects outside the estate to review construction permits, a familiar car appeared at the bottom of the hill, a silver Lexus SUV I had grown up riding in, its vanity plate still reading Sea Line in honor of my sister. Even from a distance, the sight of it stole a breath from my lungs, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Old patterns, old wounds, old ghosts. The SUV rolled up the driveway and stopped near the front gate. The doors opened almost in sync, as though my parents and Caroline had rehearsed this moment in the car. Caroline stepped out first, dressed impeccably in winter white, sunglasses hiding half her face. My parents followed close behind. My mother's smile was already plastered on before she reached the gate, wide, bright, painfully artificial. My father raised a hand in a gesture that pretended warmth while concealing discomfort. "Isabel," my mother called out in a voice she had never used on me before, soft, sugary, dipped in false pride. "Sweetheart, can we talk?" Daniel glanced at me, waiting for my cue. I gave him a small nod. He and the team quietly stepped back toward the house, giving me space. I approached the gate slowly, feeling the winter air prick at my cheeks. Caroline pushed her sunglasses up onto her head, revealing eyes swollen slightly from what I suspected was a night of frustrated crying. "So," she said, attempting a laugh that landed flat. "You've been busy." My father cleared his throat. "We, saw the news. Congratulations." "Truly." That word, truly, dropped out of his mouth like something he wasn't accustomed to saying. My mother stepped forward and placed her hand on the gate as if she owned the right to cross it. "You should have told us," she said, trying to sound wounded and affectionate at once. "We could have helped you, supported you." It reserver. I held her gaze, letting the silence sit long enough to loosen their composure. "You're doing incredible things," she continued quickly when I still didn't respond. "This foundation, this property. It's all so impressive, Isabel." Caroline exhaled sharply, folding her arms. "Yeah, congratulations, I guess." She hesitated. Then, through clenched teeth, "I didn't know you had it in you." I understood the subtext perfectly. I didn't know you were capable of being someone I could envy. My father stepped in, shifting tactics. "Look," he said, adopting a gentle, paternal tone he had never once used when I lived under his roof. "We weren't always fair to you. Maybe we didn't see your potential the way we should have. Maybe?" I didn't speak. He continued. "But families make mistakes, Isabel. And when one of us succeeds, we should all celebrate together." There it was. The truth beneath the apology. Now that you are valuable publicly, we want access to that value. Now that you have influence, we want to stand beside you. Now that the world sees you, we want to be in the picture. My mother nodded eagerly, as if sealing the sentiment. "We'd love to be involved in your foundation," she said. "In any way you think is appropriate." Caroline perked up, her voice suddenly hopeful. "I could even promote it on my platform. You know, sister to sister." A wave of clarity rolled through me, not sharp, not bitter, but clean, pure. I realized in that moment that nothing had changed for them. They had not come because they regretted the years of belittling me. They had not come because they finally wanted a relationship. They had come because my success offered something they could use. They weren't reaching for me. They were reaching for the light I now stood in. And I wasn't going to let them step into it. No, I said softly. The single syllable stilled all three of them. My father frowned. No, to what? I stepped closer to the gate. No to involvement. No to pretending we're close. No to rewriting history because the cameras are pointed at me now. My mother blinked rapidly. Isabel, honey, be reasonable. I am being reasonable, I replied, my voice calm, steady, unwavering. For the first time in my life. Caroline scoffed, her mask cracking. So that's it? You just cut us off because things are finally going well for you? I met her stare without flinching. I'm not cutting you off because things are going well for me. My throat tightened, not with sadness, but with release. I'm cutting you off because things used to go terribly for me. And you never cared. None of them spoke. The silence between us grew thick and heavy. I let the final truth fall softly, like snow settling after a storm. I don't live in the past anymore. And I don't need cleansing from people who once made me feel like I couldn't breathe. Something in all three of them collapsed subtly, quietly. A recognition, perhaps, that the version of me they controlled no longer existed. A recognition that I had outgrown the cage they built without ever realizing it had been locked. My father tried one last time, voice rough. So, this is goodbye? I nodded. Yes, it is. Caroline swallowed hard. My mother's eyes glistened with tears she probably didn't fully understand. For a moment, we simply stood there, me inside the gates of the life I built, them outside in the cold. Then my family turned back toward their SUV, their footsteps falling in uneven echoes. They didn't slam the doors, they didn't shout. They just drove away slowly, quietly, almost humbled. When the car disappeared around the curve of the driveway, the estate behind me felt different. Lighter. Brighter. Mine. I wasn't losing a family. I was letting go of a weight that had never belonged on my shoulders, and, for the first time in decades, I felt something close to peace. The Ridgeway estate reached its first stage of transformation 3 months after the auction. Construction teams had cleared the old carpets and replaced them with polished white oak, the labs were framed and wired, and the central collaboration hub already held the skeleton of long work tables and soft lounge seating. The estate that once felt like a relic of someone else's genius had begun to pulse with a new heartbeat, one shaped not by old prestige, but by the futures it would help create. On the evening the final structural inspection passed, I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking Aspen Valley. The sun was setting behind the mountains, turning the snow-covered peaks into molten gold. Twilight settled gently over the town below, painting everything in the quiet hues of new beginnings. I wrapped my hands around the balcony railing and breathed in the crisp air, thin, cold, but somehow purifying. For the first time in years, my lungs felt completely open. As I stood there, my phone buzzed softly in my pocket. Then again. I pulled it out, expecting emails or project updates, but instead I found messages, dozens of them from young women across the country. Thank you for believing in girls like us. I applied for your scholarship. Even if I don't get it, just knowing this exists makes me feel seen. No one in my family supports my interest in engineering. Your program feels like hope. I cried when I read the announcement. I've never been encouraged before. I scrolled slowly, letting each message wash over me like warm waves spreading through the cold mountain air. These weren't just thank yous. They were confirmations, proof that the pain I endured, the isolation I survived, the years of feeling invisible, all had been shaping me toward something greater than myself. Every message felt like the echo of the girl I once had been, the girl who sat alone at lunch, coding quietly on her laptop, the girl who was told she wasn't enough. The girl who left home at 19 with nothing but a dream and a determination forged from being underestimated. I closed my eyes, letting a rare softness settle into my chest. Footsteps approached behind me, measured and familiar. Daniel stepped onto the balcony, hands tucked into his coat pockets. You disappeared from the meeting, he said lightly, leaning against the railing beside me. "I figured you'd be here." "It's starting to feel like home," I replied. "This view, it's like the horizon is finally wide enough for everything I want to build." He nodded, his gaze tracing the silhouette of the mountains. After a quiet moment, he spoke more softly. "You know, when you walked us through your plans the first day, I knew it was special. But now?" He exhaled, shaking his head with awe. "Isabel, you didn't just buy a property. You rewrote the future of so many young women." His words sank into me, steady and grounding. I turned toward him, the sunlight fading behind me. "And of my own," I said. The truth tasted clean, no bitterness, no resentment, just quiet clarity. For so long, I had shaped my life around escaping the shadows of people who never saw me. But here, in the cold orange glow of sunset, surrounded by the echo of messages from young women who saw me not as a disappointment, but as a possibility, I understood something deeply. The mansion wasn't the symbol of revenge others thought it was. It was the symbol of my healing. Daniel gave a small, approving smile, then pushed off the railing. "We're heading inside for the final walkthrough whenever you're ready." "Give me a minute," I said. He nodded and returned inside, leaving me alone with the fading light. I took out my phone again, this time for something I had been avoiding since the day they showed up at my gate. My family. Their names still sat in my contacts, remnants of a life I had already chosen to leave behind. I had ignored the occasional text attempts at reconnection disguised as curiosity or shallow affection, but the last traces of their presence lived on in digital form. Maybe some people would have kept them there. Maybe some would have held on to hope or nostalgia. But healing requires pruning, growth requires boundaries, and peace requires protection. So I opened the contact list. One by one. I blocked each of them: my mother, my father, Caroline. The confirmations appeared on my screen. Blocked, blocked, blocked. Not out of anger. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. The act felt like closing a door that had been creaking open for far too long. When I finished, I locked my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and looked out once more at the twilight settling across Aspen. A soft wind brushed past me, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow, a scent that reminded me of winter mornings when the world felt fresh, untouched, ready. I stepped back inside the estate, walked through the great hall, and out toward the courtyard. The new front gate's sleek iron arcs engraved with the foundation's emblem were partially open, waiting for crews to finalize the automation system. I paused at the threshold. Behind me stood the estate, glowing with interior lights and the hum of possibility. Ahead was the long driveway leading toward a future I had carved myself. I took one step through the gate. Then another. The moment I crossed the threshold, my breath caught not in fear, but in recognition. This wasn't just a boundary of property, it was the boundary between who I had been and who I had become. Between the girl shaped by neglect and the woman defined by her own purpose. Between confinement and freedom. I turned back for a final glance at the estate, the headquarters, the sanctuary, the new beginning, and whispered to myself, "This is mine." Then I continued walking into the open air, the gate closing quietly behind me, marking the end of a life that no longer fit, and the beginning of a life that finally did. If there's one thing my story has taught me, it's this: your worth isn't determined by the people who failed to see it. For years, I tried to shrink myself to fit a family that could only recognize one version of success, one that never included me. But the moment I stopped asking for permission to exist, everything changed. Healing didn't come from proving them wrong. It came from choosing myself, from building a life rooted in purpose instead of approval. So, if you're watching this and you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or made to feel small, hear me clearly. You are allowed to outgrow any place that keeps you limited. And when you step into the world you've built on your own terms, you don't just rewrite your story, you inspire others to believe they can rewrite theirs too. Keep going. Your future is bigger than their imagination.